It's a real pleasure to introduce Jo to you tonight. Words to describe Jo. This is award-winning, force of nature, innovator, and passionate about all matters to do with equality, diversity, and inclusion. 10 years ago, Jo set up the D&I group at Portsmouth Grammar. And 9 years ago, I saw the advert for it, and it was that made me push the button on an application to become their librarian, because the work she was doing really resonated with our values as librarians. And then I got to see Jo firsthand as a practitioner in the classroom, as a trainer of all us adults in a very large space, the first person to create an engendering national conference for engendering change to do with relationships and sex education in schools. She is very rightly award-winning for her practice as a teacher, but also for the work that her company does, which she started 2 years ago, Engendering Change. And I can't even begin to tell you all the type of work that she's involved in within the city of Portsmouth in terms of charity. I think one of the best ways to describe Jo is as an agent of change. She changed the culture at Portsmouth Grammar, and its legacy, has had lasting benefits. If you haven't already seen or read her book on relationships and sex education, it is well written, well researched. It is a practical guide on how to teach, how to deal with those sensitive issues, cope with concerns raised by staff, parents, or pupils. Enough from me. On that note, Jo, it is a pleasure to welcome you to our AGM. Thank you.
Oh, what a lovely introduction. Thank you so much, Carol. Carol, the crush goes both ways. I thought you were an absolute legend, and working with you was such a pleasure. I know I've said this to you many times, but I thought you were the greatest asset PGS had, and both of my children benefited from you. So thank you so much for having me and for inviting me here this evening. I've just put my contact details in the chat so that we can stay in touch beyond today. We've got less time than we thought, so I'm going to be a little bit speedy, but still feel free to type questions as I'm going. I'm going to ignore them until the end, but type them in, post them if you want. You can privately post them to me if you prefer. And then, of course, beyond this, you're welcome to email me and get in touch. So I'm just going to share some slides, and then we'll make a start. All right, so you should be able to see those slides. Let me know if not. So as Carol said, I was at PGS. I was a teacher for about 15 years, and the last 10 of those, I was in charge of what we called pastoral curriculum. That included relationships and sex education, well-being, health education, and diversity and inclusion work, as Carol said. And a lot of the work that I did was regarded as quite groundbreaking, prescient, pushing boundaries, and particularly my work around LGBTQ inclusion and sex education garnered quite a lot of national attention. That led to me being asked to speak at other schools, deliver training, speak at conferences, and eventually it kind of grew and grew to the point where I decided that it was time for me to leave the classroom and set up Engendering Change full time. And I'm lucky enough to have 15 other incredible specialists who work with me. And we work with schools across the country, but also we deliver corporate training and community projects too. So we're going to focus today on my book. I'm very proud of my book. I have a copy of it here. And I'm also proud to say that I have just secured my second book deal. And today was my first day of writing book two. So I've been really immersed in this today. It's the book I said I would never write after finishing the first one, because it was so difficult while setting up a new business and trying to be a mother and a wife and all of those things. I was like, that's it. I'm a published author. I don't need to do it again. But of course, my first book was for teachers. It's very specifically for that audience. But what I've found is increasingly parents have been telling me they've been using my book with their kids, literally as a guide, sitting down side by side to prompt discussions and use the activities from the book. And so I've now been convinced that I have to write the second book for parents. And it's going to have the same theme. And this theme is the absolute foundation of everything that I do in terms of relationships and sex education. And that is an empowering approach. How do we empower young people with the knowledge and the skills that is going to enable them to have positive sex lives for the rest of their lives? To ensure that what they do around sex, what they think, how they behave enriches their lives rather than does the opposite. And of course, the reality is that that's often not what is happening, whether it's at school or at home. So we really needed my first book and we really need the second one. So I'm going to talk really briefly about why we need an empowering approach in terms of my first book, so Relationships and Sex Education, or RSE, and what I think that looks like pretty briefly. So why do we need empowering RSE? Actually, I should say, sorry, before I go on to my next slide, a lot of the content that I'm going to be covering in the next sort of 10 minutes is really quite sensitive subject matter. So I am going to talk about sexual violence. I'm going to talk about pornography, genitals, all kinds of things to do with relationships and sex education, which for me are everyday subject matter that I'm talking about constantly. But for many other people, this can feel a little bit jolting and a little bit confronting. And so if you need to take a little bit of space away or anything you need to do for your well-being, please do so, particularly when it comes to discussions around kind of sexual abuse and sexual violence. So the situation currently is that relationships and sex education is a statutory subject. That's across independent and state sectors, primary and secondary. And that came into force in 2020. So prior to that, it was not a statutory subject. And whilst most schools were doing something, there wasn't any agreed content that had to be covered. So this statutory content was a really welcome move. It was great. It meant that all schools are expected to teach certain content. However, unfortunately, the situation is that the provision still remains incredibly patchy. Different schools are doing completely different things. They're prioritizing it differently. They're training their staff differently. There is no consistency in terms of what is going on. And what I see in the vast majority of schools that I visit and work with is that this is a sort of afterthought. It's a promotion which is sometimes given without a member of staff even applying for the job. Often it's not well resourced. It is really the sort of bottom of the pile, despite the fact, as I'm going to argue, that this is one of the most important things schools need to be engaging with. We also find that the approach to relationships and sex education remains really old-fashioned, and in particular, incredibly heteronormative and phallocentric. So really focused on heterosexual relationships and male sexual pleasure, and really, quite an old-fashioned asserting of gender inequity. And that's something that I really want us to do better on. I also find when I work with schools that there's no kind of philosophy which underpins their programs. And this isn't really surprising because there isn't one in the statutory content. What you get is a list of subjects which have to be discovered have to be covered at various key stages. But there's no aims and ethos or philosophy which underpins why we're doing what we're doing. And so that's sort of job one when I work with schools, and indeed job one in my book, is for us to really articulate why we're doing what we're doing and that philosophy which underpins it. So the only kind of philosophy which I do see in sex education is risk management and risk aversion, how to not get pregnant, how to not get STIs, how to not rape and so on, or get raped often. And whilst Risk management is a very important part of RSE. It's a small part of a far bigger picture. What is often missing is what healthy relationships look like, what good sex looks like, how young people can get this right. And so, again, that's something that I'm really keen to help schools to do better on. And of course, you will know that the world of sex is evolving rapidly. Sex education has always been incredibly important, but with so much of what we're seeing in the world today, I would argue that the challenge is greater and the need is greater than ever before. And so, my work, what I'm seeing, of course, is that schools really need my support, but also often there's a real worry around this. There can be a huge amount of moral panic when it comes to teaching relationships and sex education. Some people fear that we're sexualizing children, that we shouldn't be talking about certain subjects. And often what I find is that rather than looking at the evidence of what we should be doing, people can kind of fall into these hysterical kind of panics around the whole thing. So my job, as I see it, is to help schools, to navigate their way through this. Now, in terms of harmful sexual behaviour, again, this is nothing new. Sexual violence has been around always. But we are seeing huge problems today, both in schools and in broader society. The Ofsted review into sexual abuse in colleges and schools made it very clear that sexual harassment is pervasive in all contexts. What they found was that schools were not well equipped to deal with this. Often, reports of sexual violence and harassment were not being made to schools, not because they weren't happening, but because young people felt that either it wasn't a problem and it had become very normalized, or they felt that they would not be believed, taken seriously, or the issue dealt with appropriately. And this has been reaffirmed in Keeping Children Safe in Education 2024, which says that all schools from primary through to secondary and college should maintain an attitude of it could happen here. So there's more consciousness and awareness now of the extent and reality of sexual violence between children in schools. Often safeguarding training is very rigorous and schools are well equipped to deal with problems as and when they occur. But what we're failing to do well, as far as I can see, is prevent these issues from happening. And we know that they are happening. On average in the UK, for every school day that there is, one rape is reported to police as having occurred on school premises. The urgency to act is undeniable. And a bit more on this, just to bring the point home. We know that 1 in 6 children is sexually abused. 1 in 6. And those people who complain that people like me should not be discussing sex, that we're sexualizing children, I really would like them to engage with that statistic. We know that ignorance around their bodies, the inability to name their genitalia and so on, is a barrier to children being able to recognize sexual abuse, report sexual abuse. We know that several legal cases have fallen through because children have been unable to talk accurately about their bodies. From day one, it is essential that we are delivering age and stage appropriate relationships and sex education. We also know that child sexual abuse and exploitation has increased by over 400% from 2013 to 2022. And very worryingly, more than 55% of child sexual abusers are children themselves. And again, what I find when I work with schools is often when they're talking to children about the threat of sexual violence and sexual harassment, they're usually talking about a paedophile, adult, groomer. But what we also need to be talking about is, and getting children to view these discussions through the lens of, is them themselves as a potential perpetrator and how they can ensure that they get consent right and that they are never crossing that line. Also, worryingly, over three-quarters of the web pages found to contain indecent images of children were self-generated. So they were created by children themselves, and in many of those cases, uploaded themselves. In other cases, they'd lost control of the image and someone else had uploaded it. And of course, there's a really gendered element to this, but perhaps even more so than many of us realize, because 99% of those self-generated images of indecent children were girls. So, what is going on here? Why is this problem apparently getting worse and so extensive? Well, of course, we know that sexual violence more broadly is a huge problem and getting worse when we look at the rape statistics and the terrible rates of any kind of justice being done. Many people argue that rape has effectively been decriminalised in this country. And so it's hardly surprising that these broader social issues are being played out in schools. We also have issues with rape culture, the legitimization, normalization, or glamorization of sexual violence. You may have seen the two women featured in the image here, Bonnie Blue and Lily Phillips. They're being discussed constantly on social media at the moment, and they're both stars of the platform OnlyFans. So that's where people are able to produce their own pornographic content and monetize it. And they've engaged in a really competitive process of these challenges where one of them slept with 100 or had sex with 100 men in 12 hours. Then the other one, 1,000 men. The other one had anal sex with 100 men, and so on. And they allow these men to spit in their faces, choke them, and slap them. Now, some people, including these women themselves, argue that they're liberated and this is a win for feminism. Other people like me are deeply concerned about this, that this is normalizing and glamorizing sexual violence. And of course, we have pornography more broadly. Half of 12-year-olds have watched online porn and 10% of 9-year-olds. We know that a third of older children who watch pornography have intentionally sought out violent acts of pornography. We also know that the younger children are, when they access porn, the more likely they are to try and mimic those behaviours in their own sex lives. And then, of course, there's people like Andrew Tate and the whole aspirational misogyny movement and incel movement that we're seeing online. And if you've watched the recent programme on Netflix, Adolescence, again, there's a lot of awareness of this. But what we're lacking is the skills and the knowledge and the confidence of teachers and parents to be able to really effectively dive into this with young people. So very quickly, before I give time for questions, what does an empowering approach look like? In my book, what I do is I go through different kind of areas of RSE. I give some of the rationale and evidence of why we need to engage with each topic and what an empowering approach looks like. And then I give a teacher toolkit with practical things that can be done in each lesson. I'm going to skip that. So for me, the pillars of an empowering approach is it has to be evidence-based. And that's how teachers need to approach it, how we discuss this with parents, and in everything that we're delivering with young people. It should be non-judgmental. This isn't about the teacher's values or their opinions. It's about providing evidence-based information which empowers all of our young people. And RSE is an amazing opportunity for us to promote gender equity and combat some of the broader problems that we're seeing in our society. And it's also the philosophy which underpins it has to be inclusive. Every single child in that room has to be able to see themselves in the curriculum, know what it means for them. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. It might be in a year, it might be in 5 years. But by providing an inclusive approach, it means that we can meet every young person where they are. And this is also about skills for life. We want to be modelling and giving children the opportunity to practice sexual literacy. Speaking about sex in an appropriate manner is a really important life skill, and RSE helps them to do that. It means they're going to be more able to go and buy condoms, get an STI test, navigate consent with a partner. It helps them to acquire critical thinking skills so that if they do watch pornography or their friends do or their partner does, that they're able to deconstruct some of the narratives in that. It helps them to acquire self-awareness and empathy so that in their relationships, they're thinking about what they're doing, how they're behaving, and then how that relates to their own character. So, as I said in the book, it is full of practical strategies, and it is all about helping young people to find their voice and tap into their own sense of agency so that their sex lives contribute positively to their well-being, their sense of self, their relationships, and every aspect of their lives, really, so that they go off feeling excited and empowered and able to tip those scales in the right direction. So I'm going to skip some of these a little bit. I'm going to just pause on this one quickly because what I find pretty consistently with the vast majority of schools that I work with is that there is a huge taboo, a total blackout when it comes to women's bodies, female sexual pleasure, women's orgasms, and genitalia, and so on. So often, a school might show a penis or a male kind of genitalia diagram, and then the female equivalent will be ovaries. That's not an accurate reflection of both sides of the coin. When I talk to teachers about the importance of discussing sexual pleasure, often they're really worried about it. They feel panicked. They feel that it's, revealing something personal about them. They feel that they can't talk about it. But my response to them is that they are talking about sexual pleasure. It's just that they're only talking about male sexual pleasure, the erection, wet dreams, the male ejaculate. And it is incredibly important that we rewrite that obviously outrageous and outdated script. The only way we can help young people to combat narratives from porn and not be part of the sexual violence problem is that they understand that sex should feel good. It should feel good for both people, that they should be asking their partner what they want, tapping into what they want, and so on. So in my book, there's loads of examples of how we can make our teaching of RSE inclusive. There are tips of how to teach sexual consent in a way that's really empowering. And again, it's about that feedback loop between both people, finding their voice and tapping into the needs of their partners. A lot of schools are really struggling with engaging boys, particularly when they're talking about sexual violence, misogyny, all of the things which are kind of really hot topics at the moment. Often the response from boys is reactive, defensive, and a lot of kind of victimhood associated with this. So I've got lots of tips that I can share with schools of how they can effectively tap into the psychology of boys and really win them over in these discussions. So I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious of time, but I hope that there was some useful kind of overview of the work that I'm doing. I would love to come into your schools. I'd love it if you grab my book and let's keep this conversation going. Thank you so much, everyone. I will take any questions you might have. Okay, so I can see one here about Catholic schools. Have I organised any training in Catholic schools? No, I am so up for it. They won't have me, sadly. I'd love to be invited to some Catholic schools, but I would have to feel safe in doing so myself. So I would have to feel really assured that the school is absolutely on board with what I'm going to be doing, and I would not be compromising on my messaging. So I don't know if that's going to work for them, but it should do. And being in a faith school does not mean that children should be missing out on this evidence-based essential education. Thank you for that question. Any others? Many school librarians restrict access to books that discuss or depict sex. For example, these books are only suitable for year 9 or above. Do you have any advice for those who don't restrict access and the arguments that they can use to defend that choice? Great question. I know that this is something Carol is really passionate about, excuse me, and probably will be able to give a better answer than I can. I guess what we've got to do is really strip back how we're justifying any kind of censorship. Is it because it's anything to do with LGBTQ? Well, that can't be justified. Is it because it's about female sexual pleasure when actually, if it was the male equivalent, we wouldn't see such a taboo? Or could there be an argument that actually this is quite disturbing and graphic content? And so we want to protect children from being disturbed. So I think we've got to really kind of unpack what judgments are we making. If it is educational and doesn't run the risk of disturbing children, then I think it's maybe a little bit difficult to defend. But again, I'm sure Carol will have a better answer there. As a librarian, I feel more comfortable stocking more books to show what love and romance are, how to love, rather than books on sex. How do we step into this role as school librarians? I think that's a great question. I mean, with my children, I mean, my son, when he was 12, 11 or 12, I think, read the Heartstopper books, which are, I guess, quite sexual. You know, he read them, he really enjoyed them, he told me all about them. I thought that was appropriate. I guess, again, it's a conversation to be had as a school, and any kind of restrictions that you're putting in place, just making sure that you can justify them. Children are going to be curious about sex. I would far rather that they learn about them from books that you've curated carefully than porn. So, and that is the literal choice that many children will be having. We want them to be learning about sex from reliable sources of information. So curating it is probably a good idea. Hopefully that answers your question. Have you thought about writing or collaborating on a book for teenagers rather than teachers or parents? Yes, I have, but there's only so many hours in the day. I definitely want to, but I'm thinking probably something more like an app or website or something like that. Sorry, librarians, that's probably not what you want to hear. But I don't know. I would love to do that, definitely. And I think it's really important. Any book recommendations for you? I'll have a think about that and I'll email them through if that's okay. So I'm conscious we've just got 3 minutes left. I went through those really quickly. Do feel free to turn on mics and talk to me if you would prefer, but hopefully that's given you some food for thought.
Yeah, appalling statistics. Just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I was having trouble believing them.
Mm,
It's like really that
yeah.
it was couldn't believe it. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're very useful statistics because they really, I think, help make the case for why we have to engage. And I think
Yeah.
in your roles, that may be something that you want to think about too. You know, why is it that you as a librarian want to make the case for providing reliable sources of information, or the opportunity for children to explore their curiosity around sex? Well, this can help paint a picture and justify why that is. What's the alternative? The alternative is they're going to go online.
Yeah.
I think I was going to say,
Sorry.
sorry, go on.
So your talks, Joe, do you do them to teachers, or do you do them to students, or both really?
So I do both. My preference, if I'm going in to do anything in a school, is always teacher training for all staff. That's what I want to be doing. I'm happy to do student talks as well, but what I want to do is engender change. That's the name of my business. That's what I do. I want to engender cultural change and empower every member of that community to get on board with a shared consciousness and a singular mission, which is empowering relationships and sex education. So for me, the priority is staff training from the top and every single member of staff. And actually, on that note, I should have said, I forgot to say, on my website, which I've given you a link to, on the resources tab, I have created a free resource which is called Preventing Child-on-Child Sexual Violence and Sexual Harassment, a toolkit for schools and colleges. That's a free resource that can be downloaded. I would love it if you could compel every single member of staff in your school to read it. It is really important. This shouldn't just be a job for sex ed teachers or, the DSL or pastoral leads. Every single person interacting with young people should be engaging with this. So yeah, that's my preference is to get everyone on board with this. And if I can do staff, teachers, parents and students, all the better.
I will put the link for the webinar in our next newsletter and also the resources to
Thank you.
highlight it to our members. So, but I think you're right. I think if you train the staff, that gives them confidence to address this. I think a lot of staff don't address it because they don't have the confidence to do so. They don't know how to do it. It's like when they hear LGBTQ comments, homophobic bullying and things like this. They don't know how to address it, so they don't say anything, a lot of staff, and it gets ignored. And I think this is probably the same in this instance, isn't it?
And we need to empower staff, it's different.
Yeah.
We've all grown up with social scripts and sexual scripts around, all of these issues. And so it can be difficult sometimes to deconstruct, for me, internalized misogyny or internalized biphobia or whatever it might be. And so if we can deliver training that really helps to rationalize why we're doing what we're doing and how we do it, then it's possible for everyone to get on board with that and for us to have a cultural shift.
Yeah, definitely.
I think there's another question about sources from the statistics you shared. Have you got the source?
All in my book. So the ones which I think the ones which I shared, the sources were there. The ones which I said verbally were the Children's Commissioner report into pornography, which was published in January 2023. So that was the one that found that half of 12-year-olds and 10% of 9-year-olds had watched porn. All of the other stats, they're also in the toolkit on my website as well, which I mentioned. So yeah, you can find them all there. There's a massive reference list at the end as well with all the links.
Thoroughly well researched.
Always. It's important. We've got to be very robust with what we're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Jo. That's been fab.
My
I'm
pleasure.
so glad you could give up some time to us this evening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Mm.